They called him the Ice King of Manhattan, but no one ever asked what it cost a man to become cold. The autumn wind swept through Central Park, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and freshly brewed coffee from a nearby cafe as the city rushed forward without ever looking back. Somewhere beyond the towering glass buildings and luxury penthouses, men lowered their voices when they spoke Vincent Romano's name. At 34 years old, he had built an empire that commanded respect, loyalty, and silence. His schedule was planned down to the minute. His world was guarded by men in tailored suits and secured behind gates taller than most dreams. Yet none of it could quiet the emptiness that followed him home every night. The newspapers called him a billionaire businessman. Wall Street called him untouchable. His enemies called him dangerous. Vincent preferred not to call himself anything at all. Because labels only mattered when there was still something human left underneath them. That morning had begun like every other. Meetings. Contracts. Endless conversations about acquisitions and investments worth more money than most people would see in their lifetime. He had sat at the head of a 12-foot conference table while executives competed for his approval. He had nodded when appropriate, signed documents without hesitation, and walked away from another successful deal that should have made him feel something. It didn't. Success had become as ordinary to him as breathing. By 2 in the afternoon, Manhattan felt louder than usual. The flashing cameras outside his building. The reporters chasing rumors about his private life. The endless expectations waiting behind every phone call. Vincent told his driver to take the long way home before changing his mind entirely. Sometimes he wondered what it might feel like to disappear for an hour. Not as Vincent Romano. Not as the man everyone feared disappointing. Just another stranger sitting beneath the autumn sky. When his black SUV stopped beside Central Park, even his security team looked surprised. He stepped out wearing a simple charcoal coat and dark jeans, leaving behind the expensive watch that usually rested on his wrist. The crisp October air brushed against his face as he walked alone along the winding pathways lined with golden leaves. Children laughed somewhere in the distance while couples shared coffee on nearby benches. It was a world he rarely noticed. A world that existed quietly beyond power and wealth. Then he found it. An old oak tree standing proudly beside a small hill overlooking the park. Vincent sat beneath its sprawling branches and leaned against its weathered trunk. For the first time in weeks, no one was asking anything of him. No one expected answers. Closing his eyes, he pretended to sleep. Not because he was tired, but because sometimes pretending to belong nowhere felt better than belonging everywhere. He didn't know that within a few minutes, a 3-year-old little boy carrying half a cookie would change the course of his life forever. The sounds of New York faded into something softer beneath the old oak tree. Children laughed somewhere nearby as squirrels darted across the grass, gathering acorns before winter arrived. Vincent had almost forgotten what an ordinary afternoon sounded like. There were no ringing phones. No men waiting for his decisions. No headlines discussing his business empire. Just the gentle rustling of leaves dancing in the cool October breeze. Keeping his eyes closed, he listened to the distant melody of a street musician playing an acoustic guitar near the fountain. For the first time in years, silence did not feel lonely. It felt unfamiliar. Then came the sound of tiny footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. Slow. Curious. Unhurried. Vincent assumed the child was simply passing by. Central Park was filled with families on weekends, and he had chosen this spot precisely because it reminded him that life existed beyond boardrooms and skyscrapers. The footsteps stopped directly in front of him. He resisted opening his eyes. A few seconds passed in complete silence before he heard the smallest little voice speak. "Mom says sleeping outside makes people cold." Vincent nearly smiled at the unexpected comment, but remained perfectly still. The voice could not have belonged to anyone older than 3 or 4 years old. "Do you think he is hungry, Mr. Bear?" the child whispered. Vincent frowned slightly. Mr. Bear? He could only assume the boy was speaking to a stuffed animal, or perhaps his own imagination. Children had always fascinated him in that way. They spoke to the world as if everything around them possessed a soul. Another moment passed before he felt something gently placed into his hand. It was warm and surprisingly soft. His fingers instinctively curled around it. "You can have my cookie," the little voice continued. "Mom says sharing is what good people do." Vincent slowly opened one eye after hearing small footsteps retreat a few inches. Standing before him was a little boy with tousled golden brown hair and bright blue eyes that seemed impossibly sincere. The child wore a tiny navy blue jacket with dinosaur patches sewn onto the sleeves and clutched a worn stuffed bear beneath one arm. In Vincent's palm rested half of a chocolate chip cookie that had clearly been broken in two. The boy could not have been older than 3. Vincent stared at the cookie in silence. No one had ever offered him something that belonged to them simply because they thought he might need it. People gave him gifts worth thousands of dollars every year. Luxury watches, rare wines, handcrafted artwork. Yet somehow, half of a child's cookie felt more valuable than any of them. "Why are you giving this to me?" Vincent finally asked quietly, his voice softer than he intended. The little boy tilted his head as though the answer were obvious. "Because you looked lonely." The word struck Vincent harder than any criticism he had ever received in his life. Lonely. It was not a word anyone had ever used to describe him. Powerful. Wealthy. Intelligent. Dangerous. Those were the words people chose when they spoke about Vincent Romano. Never lonely. The little boy sat down beside him beneath the old oak tree and smiled as if sharing half a cookie with a stranger was the most natural thing in the world. Vincent looked down at the small piece of chocolate chip cookie resting in his hand and realized something impossible had just happened. For the very first time in years, someone had looked at him and seen not the empire he built, but simply a man sitting alone beneath a tree. Vincent looked down at the little boy sitting beside him, and wondered how someone so small could speak with such certainty. The child did not seem intimidated by strangers or distracted by the busy world around him. Instead, he carefully adjusted his stuffed bear's tiny scarf before looking back at Vincent with complete sincerity. "My name is Oliver," he announced proudly. "And this is Mr. Buttons. He likes cookies too, but he already had his snack." Vincent could not remember the last time someone had introduced themselves to him without first knowing exactly who he was. There was something strangely refreshing about being nothing more than a man sitting beneath a tree. "Vincent," he replied simply. Oliver's face immediately brightened. "That is a grown-up name," he said with an approving nod. "My mommy says grown-ups forget to smile because they pay bills and drink too much coffee." Vincent laughed quietly before he could stop himself. The sound surprised even him. It had been years since laughter had escaped so naturally. Oliver smiled triumphantly as though making adults laugh was one of his greatest accomplishments. "See? You look better now," he declared. "You looked sad before." Vincent found himself studying the little boy more closely. His jacket was clean but slightly worn around the sleeves. His sneakers had cartoon dinosaurs printed on the sides, and one of the shoelaces was tied unevenly. Everything about him spoke of a childhood filled with love rather than luxury. "Do you always share your cookies with strangers?" Vincent asked. Oliver nodded enthusiastically. "Only if they need one." "And how do you know when someone needs one?" The boy thought seriously for a moment before pointing directly at Vincent's face. "Your eyes looked lonely." Before Vincent could respond, a woman's voice suddenly called out from somewhere beyond the walking path. "Oliver Bennett!" The voice carried equal parts panic and exhaustion. A moment later, Vincent saw her approaching quickly through the autumn leaves. She could not have been older than 28. Her blonde hair had been loosely tied back into a practical ponytail that was beginning to come undone from hurrying across the park. She wore a cream-colored sweater beneath a light gray coat and carried an oversized canvas-tote bag hanging from one shoulder. Despite her obvious beauty, it was the exhaustion in her blue eyes that caught Vincent's attention first. She looked like someone who had not slept properly in months. Relief immediately flooded her expression when she spotted Oliver sitting safely beneath the tree. "Oliver!" she exclaimed softly as she hurried over and knelt beside him. "You cannot wander off like that." I was terrified. The little boy threw his arms around her neck without hesitation. I was helping Mr. Vincent, he explained cheerfully. He looked lonely and hungry, so I gave him half my cookie. Claire Bennett froze as her eyes finally landed on Vincent sitting quietly beside her son. Embarrassment immediately colored her face. Oh my goodness, she said apologetically. I am so sorry if he bothered you. Oliver loves talking to people and sometimes decides everyone needs his help. Vincent glanced down at the half cookie still resting in his hand before looking back at the tired young mother kneeling beside her son. He did not bother me, he said honestly. In fact, he may have helped me more than he realizes. Claire smiled politely, though she still looked embarrassed by her son's unexpected generosity. She had no way of knowing that the little boy she was raising had just done something no amount of wealth, power, or success had ever accomplished. For the first time in years, Vincent Romano no longer felt invisible beneath the weight of his own life. Claire settled onto the park bench beside Oliver with the weary grace of someone who had learned to do 3 things at once every hour of every day. She brushed a few fallen leaves from her son's jacket before offering Vincent an apologetic smile. Thank you for keeping an eye on him, she said softly. He has a habit of adopting lonely people whenever we come here. Vincent raised an eyebrow. Adopting lonely people? Oliver nodded enthusiastically before Claire could answer. Last week, we adopted an old man who missed his dog, he explained proudly. Mom bought him hot chocolate, and I told him jokes about dinosaurs. Claire laughed quietly and shook her head. Oliver believes kindness is a full-time job. There was something warm and effortless about the way she spoke to her son. Vincent noticed how Oliver naturally leaned against her side, completely secure in her presence. He had spent his entire life around carefully rehearsed conversations and guarded smiles. Watching the two of them felt almost foreign. Do you come here often? Vincent asked. Every Saturday afternoon, Claire replied. It is free entertainment, and Oliver likes feeding squirrels and talking to strangers. Only nice strangers, Oliver quickly corrected. Mom says we do not talk to creepy people. Vincent laughed softly at the boy's serious expression. That is very good advice. Oliver studied Vincent for several seconds before asking, Do you have any children? The question caught Vincent off guard. No, he answered honestly. Do you have a wife? No. Oliver frowned thoughtfully. Do you have a mommy? Vincent blinked at the unexpected question. Not anymore. A daddy? Not anymore. The little boy's expression immediately softened. That makes me sad. Vincent felt something shift inside his chest at the simplicity of those words. Oliver was not asking because he was curious about wealth or success. He simply wanted to know whether Vincent had people who loved him. Who gives you hugs when you are sad? Oliver continued innocently. Claire's eyes widened in embarrassment. Oliver, she said gently, we do not ask people questions like that. Why not? He asked. Everyone gets sad sometimes. Vincent looked away for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the golden leaves dancing across the park pathway. He honestly could not remember the last time anyone had hugged him simply because he needed one. Somewhere along the way, people had stopped seeing him as a person and started seeing him as a responsibility, an employer, or a powerful man whose life appeared perfect from the outside. I suppose I usually deal with being sad by working, Vincent admitted quietly. Oliver looked genuinely concerned by his answer. That sounds terrible, he declared. When I am sad, Mommy makes pancakes with extra chocolate chips. Claire laughed softly and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Unfortunately, pancakes are not a cure for everything. They are for me, Oliver insisted confidently. Vincent smiled as he watched the two of them tease each other. The autumn sun had begun dipping lower in the sky, casting everything in shades of gold and amber. It struck him then that neither Claire nor Oliver cared who he was or what he owned. To them, he was simply Vincent, the lonely man beneath the oak tree who needed half a cookie and perhaps, though either of them knew it yet, a little more kindness than he had ever allowed himself to receive. By the time the church bells across the park chimed 4 o'clock, Vincent realized nearly an hour had passed without him checking his phone. That alone felt extraordinary. Claire had unpacked a small lunch from her canvas tote bag while Oliver sat cross-legged on the blanket beside her, enthusiastically explaining why dinosaurs would have made terrible apartment pets. Vincent found himself listening more than speaking, content to watch the quiet rhythm of their little world unfold. There was something undeniably comforting about the simplicity of their afternoon. No luxury restaurants. No exclusive events. Just homemade peanut butter sandwiches, apple slices, and a mother who smiled every time her son laughed. Eventually, Claire glanced at the time on her phone and sighed softly. "We should probably get going," she said as she began gathering their things. "I still have another shift tonight." Vincent frowned slightly. "You work weekends?" Claire laughed quietly. "I work almost every day." Oliver immediately chimed in. "Mommy works all the time because grown-up things are expensive." Claire smiled apologetically. "That is unfortunately very accurate." Vincent noticed the exhaustion in her expression returning almost immediately at the mention of work. It was subtle, but impossible to miss once he knew where to look. "What do you do?" he asked. "A little bit of everything these days," Claire admitted with a soft laugh. "I work mornings cleaning offices downtown 3 days a week. I work as a maid for a private residence in Manhattan on weekends, and I take evening shifts helping at a small bakery near our apartment whenever they need extra hands." Vincent was silent for several moments. 3 jobs. She could not have been older than 28, yet she carried herself with the quiet resilience of someone who had learned to survive without expecting life to become easier. "That sounds exhausting," he finally said. Claire shrugged lightly as if she had long ago stopped allowing herself to complain. "It pays the rent and keeps Oliver happy. That is what matters." Oliver tugged gently on Vincent's sleeve. "Mommy says I am her favorite investment," he whispered proudly. Claire laughed at her son's choice of words. "I may have accidentally taught him financial vocabulary." Vincent smiled despite himself. "That seems like a worthwhile investment." As they walked together toward the park entrance, Oliver insisted on holding Vincent's hand with one hand and his mother's with the other. The simple gesture caught Vincent entirely by surprise. He could not remember the last time anyone had reached for his hand without hesitation or expectation. Near the entrance, Claire paused beside a city bus stop and adjusted Oliver's scarf. Vincent's eyes briefly fell upon her hands. The sleeves of her sweater concealed most of them, but he could still see faint redness across her knuckles and dry skin that suggested long hours spent cleaning and working. Hands that worked tirelessly so a little boy could grow up believing half a cookie could change someone's day. "Thank you again for spending time with him," Claire said sincerely. "Oliver does not meet many people who are willing to answer all of his questions." Vincent glanced down at the little boy smiling beside him. "I think I should be thanking both of you." Oliver grinned and held up his stuffed bear. "Mr. Buttons likes you too," he announced proudly. As the bus finally arrived, Vincent watched the small family climb aboard together. Through the window, Oliver waved enthusiastically while Claire offered him one final smile. Before taking her seat, for reasons he could not yet explain, Vincent remained standing there long after the bus disappeared into the busy Manhattan streets, realizing that for the first time in years, he was already wondering when he might see them again. The penthouse overlooking Manhattan felt colder than usual that evening. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed millions of city lights sparkling beneath the night sky, yet Vincent barely noticed them as he stood alone in his study holding the small napkin Oliver had accidentally left tucked inside the cookie wrapper. 3 simple words had been scribbled in blue crayon across its surface. "Share with friends." Vincent smiled faintly as he placed it carefully beside his untouched glass of sparkling water. He had spent years collecting rare art pieces worth more than most homes, but somehow a child's handwriting had become the most valuable thing on his desk. The following Monday arrived with its usual routine of meetings and endless responsibilities, but something had changed. During an executive presentation discussing quarterly projections, Vincent found himself wondering whether Oliver liked chocolate milk with breakfast, or if Claire had managed to get enough sleep the night before. By lunchtime, he had become increasingly irritated by his inability to stop thinking about two strangers he had met beneath an oak tree. "Cancel my 6 o'clock dinner," he instructed calmly as his assistant reviewed his schedule. "Sir? And clear tomorrow morning." His assistant blinked in surprise. Vincent Romano did not cancel meetings. He certainly did not clear his schedule without explanation. "May I ask what this concerns?" she asked cautiously. Vincent paused for a moment before answering. "A friend." The word felt unfamiliar leaving his mouth. The next afternoon, Vincent found himself returning to Central Park at nearly the exact same time as before. He told himself it was coincidence. His driver knew better than to question him. As he approached the old oak tree, his eyes immediately searched the surrounding pathways until he spotted a familiar little boy chasing pigeons while laughing loudly enough to turn several heads. Nearby, Oliver's face lit up the moment he recognized Vincent. "Mr. Vincent!" he shouted excitedly before running toward him with surprising speed for someone whose shoelaces were untied. Vincent knelt just in time to catch him in a spontaneous hug that somehow felt completely natural. "You came back," Oliver announced happily. "I told Mommy lonely people sometimes need extra cookies." Claire laughed softly as she approached, carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate, and looking equally surprised and pleased to see him. "I was beginning to think Oliver had invented you," she joked. Vincent accepted the offered hot chocolate with an appreciative smile. "I suppose I wanted to make sure Mr. Buttons approved of me." Oliver gasped dramatically before pulling his stuffed bear from his backpack. "He does," he whispered confidentially. "He says you need more snacks and fewer meetings." Claire nearly choked on her laughter while Vincent found himself laughing freely once again. As they sat together beneath the old oak tree, conversation flowed effortlessly. Claire mentioned she had just finished cleaning a 7-bedroom townhouse on the Upper East Side before rushing to pick Oliver up from preschool. "Do you ever take a day off?" Vincent asked quietly. She smiled tiredly over the rim of her hot chocolate. "Single mothers do not really get those." There was no bitterness in her voice. Only acceptance. Oliver climbed onto the bench beside Vincent, and rested his small head against his shoulder. "Mommy says when I grow up, I should marry someone kind," he said thoughtfully. "But I told her she should find someone kind first because she deserves it more than me." Vincent looked toward Claire and noticed she had suddenly gone quiet. For reasons he could not yet explain, he found himself silently agreeing with her son. Somewhere between half a cookie and 2 afternoons beneath an old oak tree, Vincent Romano had begun wanting something he never believed belonged in his world. He wanted to protect the smile of a little boy and the tired eyes of the woman who had raised him with nothing but kindness to give. The last week of October arrived with an early evening chill that painted Manhattan in shades of amber and gold. Vincent had quietly become part of Claire and Oliver's Saturday routine. Sometimes he brought coloring books for Oliver or hot apple cider from the small cafe near the park entrance. Other times he simply sat beside them beneath the old oak tree while listening to Oliver's endless stories about dinosaurs, astronauts, and why squirrels probably had important meetings hidden somewhere in the city. It amazed Vincent how naturally they had welcomed him into their lives without asking for anything in return. One Saturday afternoon, Oliver sat beside him drawing pictures with oversized crayons while Claire answered a work call from her employer. Vincent glanced down at the paper resting in the little boy's lap and smiled. 3 stick figures stood beneath a large green tree. One had blonde hair. One wore a blue jacket. The tallest figure wore a black coat and held everyone's hands. "Who is this?" Vincent asked softly, pointing toward the tallest drawing. Oliver smiled proudly. "That is our family picture." The simple words caught Vincent completely off guard. "Your family picture?" "Of course," Oliver replied as though there could be no other explanation. "You always sit with us under the tree. Mommy smiles more when you are here. Mr. Buttons likes you too. That means you are family." Vincent felt something tighten unexpectedly in his chest. He had spent years building walls around himself so tall that no one had ever been invited inside. Yet somehow, a 3-year-old boy had simply walked through them carrying half a cookie and a box of crayons. Later that afternoon, Claire sat quietly beside Vincent while Oliver chased bubbles floating across the park. "You know," she began softly, "I have not seen him laugh this much in a very long time." Vincent looked toward Oliver as he attempted to catch a bubble nearly twice the size of his hand. "He seems like a happy child." "He is," Claire smiled warmly. "But life has not always been easy for us. There were times when I worried I could not give him everything he deserved." Vincent noticed the familiar exhaustion returning briefly to her expression before she continued. "Children are strange in the most beautiful way. They do not remember how much money you have or how expensive their toys are. They remember who showed up." Those words remained with Vincent long after she spoke them. Children remember who showed up. That evening, after saying goodbye outside the subway station, Oliver suddenly wrapped his tiny arms around Vincent's leg. "Can I tell you a secret?" he whispered seriously. Vincent knelt beside him. "Of course." Oliver glanced toward his mother before leaning closer. "Every night before bed, I ask God to send Mommy someone who makes her smile when she is tired." Vincent's expression softened immediately. "That is a very kind thing to ask for." Oliver nodded confidently. "I think God is working on it." Before Vincent could respond, the little boy added, "You smile more now, too. Did you know that?" The question lingered in Vincent's mind throughout the drive home. Standing before the massive windows of his penthouse later that night, he caught his reflection staring back at him. For years, he had accepted loneliness as the inevitable cost of power and success. But now, he found himself looking forward to Saturday afternoons beneath an old oak tree more than any accomplishment waiting for him in Manhattan. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped pretending to visit the park by coincidence. The truth was much simpler than that. Vincent Romano was beginning to understand that sometimes, the people who save your life do not arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes, they arrive carrying crayons, stuffed bears, and prayers whispered before bedtime. November arrived quietly in Manhattan. The trees throughout Central Park had begun surrendering their final golden leaves to the cold morning winds, and the city itself seemed softer beneath the glow of approaching holidays. For Vincent, Saturdays had become something sacred. He no longer checked his calendar before visiting the old oak tree. It had simply become where he belonged. One Saturday morning, however, Claire and Oliver never arrived. Vincent waited nearly 45 minutes before convincing himself they were simply running late. By another 30 minutes, he found himself glancing toward every family walking through the park. The familiar sound of Oliver's laughter never came. Concern slowly settled into his chest. When his phone finally rang that afternoon, it was Claire. Her voice sounded exhausted and apologetic. "I am so sorry," she said softly. "Oliver came down with a fever last night. Nothing serious according to his pediatrician, but he has been sleeping most of the day." Vincent found himself unexpectedly relieved. "How is he feeling now?" "Better," she replied. "He keeps asking whether Mr. Vincent is waiting for him under the tree." The corners of Vincent's mouth lifted into a smile he could no longer hide whenever Oliver's name appeared in conversation. Without thinking twice, he stopped by a local bookstore before visiting a neighborhood bakery that sold handmade cinnamon rolls. 2 hours later, he stood outside Claire's modest apartment building carrying a paper bag filled with children's books and enough soup to feed an entire family. Claire opened the door looking both surprised and embarrassed. "You really did not have to do this," she said quietly. "I know," Vincent replied honestly. "I wanted to." The apartment was small but warm. Children's drawings decorated the refrigerator alongside preschool art projects and handwritten grocery lists. There were toys neatly arranged in baskets, and a small bookshelf filled with picture books that had clearly been read dozens of times. It was not luxurious, but it felt more like home than any place Vincent had lived in years. Oliver sat wrapped in a dinosaur blanket on the living room sofa holding Mr. Buttons against his chest. The moment he saw Vincent, his face immediately brightened despite his fever. "You came!" he exclaimed excitedly before coughing lightly. "Of course I did," Vincent smiled as he handed him one of the books. I heard someone was skipping our Saturday meeting. Oliver giggled before carefully opening the gift. Mommy says people only visit when they really care about you. Vincent glanced toward Claire, who suddenly became very interested in stirring a pot of soup on the stove. That evening, they shared homemade grilled cheese sandwiches while Oliver proudly explained every stuffed animal living in his bedroom. Watching Claire laugh as her son dramatically introduced each toy by name, Vincent realized he had never experienced anything like this before. There were no expectations sitting around their small kitchen table. No negotiations. No hidden motives. Just kindness freely given. Later, after Oliver had fallen asleep with his new book resting against his chest, Vincent quietly helped Claire wash the dinner dishes. You know, she said softly while drying a coffee mug. He prayed for you tonight. Vincent paused. For me? She smiled warmly. He thanked God for sending his friend back to visit him when he was sick. Vincent looked toward the hallway where Oliver slept peacefully, and felt something inside him finally begin to heal. He had spent years believing love had to be earned through success, power, or sacrifice. Yet this little family had offered it freely simply because he showed up. Standing in Claire's tiny kitchen, listening to the distant sounds of New York settling into the evening, Vincent realized he was no longer afraid of wanting what he saw before him. For the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand that home is not a place you build. Sometimes, it is a feeling you are lucky enough to find sitting at a kitchen table with people who quietly decide you belong there. 1 year later, the first snow of December settled gently across Central Park, turning the familiar pathways into something that looked like a scene from an old Christmas postcard. The great oak tree stood proudly in the center of it all, its branches dusted with white as though time itself had decided to pause for just a moment. Vincent stood beneath it wearing the same charcoal coat he had worn the afternoon his life quietly changed forever. Beside him, Oliver laughed as he attempted to build what he proudly called the world's greatest snow dinosaur. At 4 years old now, he remained absolutely convinced that dinosaurs would have loved winter if only someone had invented scarves for them. Claire stood nearby holding 2 cups of hot chocolate, smiling as she watched the 2 most important people in her life argue over whether snow dinosaurs needed tails. There were still difficult days. Claire still worked because she loved helping others, though not because she had to anymore. Oliver still asked more questions in a single afternoon than most adults asked in an entire week. Vincent still preferred quiet rooms and thoughtful silences. But somewhere between autumn leaves and bedtime prayers, they had learned that families are not always born. Sometimes, they are patiently built through kindness, one ordinary moment at a time. Vincent reached into his coat pocket and smiled as his fingers brushed against the same blue crayon napkin he had carried with him every day for an entire year. Share with friends. It remained folded neatly beside his wallet, reminding him that the most important investment of his life had begun with half of a chocolate chip cookie. Mr. Vincent, Oliver suddenly called out while placing a tiny scarf around his snow dinosaur. Do you remember when you looked lonely under this tree? Vincent laughed softly. I remember. Oliver grinned proudly. You do not look lonely anymore. Vincent glanced toward Claire, whose eyes met his with the same warmth they always carried whenever she looked at him. She had once apologized for her son's endless kindness. Now, Vincent thanked God for it every single day. Taking a deep breath, he gently took Claire's hand before kneeling down beside Oliver in the snow. I have something important I would like to ask both of you, he said quietly. Oliver's eyes immediately widened with excitement. Is it about dinosaurs? Vincent smiled. Not this time. He looked toward Claire first. A year ago, I believed I had everything I could ever need. I was wrong. His voice remained calm, though his words carried more honesty than any business speech he had ever given. You and Oliver taught me that success means very little if there is no one waiting to share it with you. You showed me what home feels like. You reminded me how to laugh again. Most importantly, you welcomed me into your lives before I ever believed I deserved to be there. Claire's eyes filled with quiet tears as he continued. Claire Bennett, would you marry me? Before she could answer, Vincent turned toward Oliver and smiled. And Oliver Bennet, would you let me spend the rest of my life being there for every dinosaur story, every school recital, every birthday cake, and every Saturday afternoon beneath this tree? Oliver immediately threw his arms around Vincent's neck. That means you are asking to be my daddy too, right? Vincent smiled through the unexpected emotion tightening in his chest. If you will have me. Yes. Oliver shouted loud enough to startle nearby pigeons. I have been waiting all year. Claire laughed through her tears before quietly whispering, yes. Later that afternoon, as the three of them walked hand in hand through the snow-covered park, Vincent realized something extraordinary. He had spent his entire life building an empire that made the world pay attention to him. In the end, however, the greatest thing he would ever build was a family that taught him how to love. And it all began because a little boy looked at a lonely stranger beneath an old oak tree and decided that half of his cookie was worth sharing.